Back in 1905, the state of Louisiana harbored corners so remote that the march of industrial civilization hadn't yet reached them. Deep within the swampland surrounding Shreveport, isolated family clans existed in absolute seclusion, clinging to customs passed down from the earliest French settlers. Yet some of these age-old traditions had twisted into forms beyond imagination across the passing generations. What I'm about to share with you stands among the most chilling accounts I've ever encountered, a tale revealing what transpires when extreme isolation merges with the desperate struggle for survival. This story demonstrates how human beings can metamorphose into entities far more terrifying than any creature born of fiction. Around the outskirts of Shreveport, whispers started spreading about entire families vanishing without explanation while journeying along the backcountry roads leading inland. Abandoned carts would be discovered, horses wandering loose, yet never a single corpse to be found. These people seemed to have been swallowed by the earth itself, leaving not even a trace behind. What nobody could have fathomed was that deep in the heart of those swamps, one particular family had engineered a horrifying answer to their food shortage crisis. An answer that would span generations, built on secrets, bloodshed, and a tradition that would test every boundary of what we understand about human nature. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. And if this marks your first visit to the channel, hit that subscribe button. You definitely don't want to miss the upcoming stories I've prepared for you. For over 60 years, the Broussard family had occupied an isolated tract of land buried deep within Louisiana's marshlands. This inherited property, handed down through successive generations, lay nearly 2 hours by horseback from the closest settlement, reachable only via muddy pathways that became completely impassable whenever rains fell. This was precisely the type of location where someone could exist, and perish, without the outside world ever becoming aware of their presence. The Broussard clan's true size exceeded anything the surrounding region suspected. 14 souls inhabited that distant property, forming a cut-off community that had cultivated its own systems and customs throughout decades of total isolation. The family's structure proved both intricate and deeply troubling, the product of generation after generation of marriages between closely related kin. At the family's helm stood Clemenose Broussard, the 75-year-old matriarch who wielded absolute command. Though small in stature and bent by the weight of years, her eyes still burned with a merciless intelligence that made anyone in her presence deeply uneasy. She wore the same threadbare black dress day after day, wrapped in a shawl that reeked of smoke and something else, something the neighbors could never quite place. Aucht Broussard, 42 years of age, served as the acknowledged patriarch and Clemenose's son. Towering and gaunt, with hollow eyes that perpetually regarded strangers with suspicion, he rarely spoke, and when words did escape him, they emerged as a hoarse rasp more resembling a growl than human speech. His massive hands carried the scars of decades spent wielding makeshift implements and performing labor that outsiders couldn't fully comprehend. Standing alongside Aucht was his half-sister, Cordelia Broussard, 38, who exercised nearly equivalent power within the family. As Clemenose's daughter by a different partner, she'd been raised within this same heritage of isolation and interbreeding. Cordelia orchestrated the activities of the women and children, her intimidating demeanor ensuring unquestioning obedience from all. She possessed the same sunken eyes as Aucht, though paired with a more refined breed of cruelty, as if she'd perfected more sophisticated techniques for controlling the younger family members. Cousins Beauregard and Magnolia Broussard, aged 35 and 29 respectively, rounded out the family's adult nucleus. Beauregard was a heavy-set, taciturn man who seldom uttered a word, yet whose sheer physical presence intimidated anyone who ventured near the property. Magnolia, meanwhile, displayed an almost cult-like devotion to Clemenose, echoing her words and carrying out her commands with precision that bordered on obsession. The older offspring formed a middle tier in the family's pecking order. Ulay, 25, was Aucht's daughter who occasionally ventured into the village to barter salted meat for necessities. Boudreaux, 21, and also Aucht's son, regularly accompanied the family on their hunting expeditions. Both spoke even less than the adults, limiting their communication to nods and gestures when conducting business in town. However, it was the 7 children and teenagers who drew the most attention from those who occasionally glimpsed them. Thibodeau, 16, and Celeste, 14, were the eldest of this group and exhibited a disturbing maturity beyond their years. They carried themselves with adult confidence while maintaining childlike submission to their elders' commands. The remaining 5 youngsters, Octave at 12, Sidonie at 10, the 8-year-old twins Alcy and Anatole, and little Azeli at just 6, were rarely spotted by outsiders. On those rare occasions when they did appear, they stayed huddled together, conversing in hushed tones using an ancient French dialect that even the oldest French-descended residents in the area couldn't entirely decipher. The Broussard estate resembled a maze of ramshackle structures scattered across multiple acres of swampland. The primary dwelling, constructed from darkened timber and topped with a corroded zinc roof, housed the adults and older children. Surrounding it stood smaller cabins, storage sheds, dilapidated corral, and buildings that seemed to have been erected without any coherent plan, as though each generation had simply constructed whatever they required at the moment. What struck observers most forcefully was the organized silence that blanketed the property. Despite 14 people residing there, raised voices or noisy activities were virtually never heard. Labor was performed in almost sacred quietude, with each family member instinctively understanding their duties without requiring verbal direction. During the winter months of 1901, something fundamental shifted within the Broussard family. According to subsequent observations made by Father Gilbert Horton, this period marked when the family began displaying signs of inexplicable prosperity. Their clothing, though modest, appeared to be in superior condition. The children, who'd previously looked undernourished, started showing evidence of more plentiful nourishment. Starting in 1902, local shopkeepers began noticing substantial changes in how the Broussards conducted themselves. Their trips to town grew more frequent and better organized, with different family members appearing weekly to exchange vast quantities of salted meat for essential goods. The volume of meat they brought to market had increased dramatically, suggesting a far more abundant game supply than any isolated family should reasonably be able to secure. Oulet remained the primary negotiator, materializing weekly with sacks brimming with uniformly cut meat, always expertly salted and bundled in clean fabric. But now she frequently arrived accompanied by Magnolia or some of the older adolescents, who hauled additional loads of meat and hides for sale. The local merchant who dealt most regularly with the family started questioning where all this meat originated. The sheer quantity seemed remarkable for a family that apparently didn't maintain herds large enough to justify such production. When he inquired about the source, he invariably received the same terse answer: swamp game. Yet this man, who'd grown up in the region and knew intimately every type of game the swamps offered, observed that this particular meat possessed peculiar qualities. It was lighter in color than venison, more tender than wild boar, and carried a distinctive odor even after being salted, an aroma he couldn't identify but that triggered a vague sense of nausea whenever he detected it. The behavior of the Broussard children had also undergone a significant transformation since 1902. During their town visits, they exhibited military-like discipline, constantly maintaining formation and never wandering from their adult supervisors. Yet something different gleamed in their eyes, a satisfaction that hadn't existed previously, as though they'd discovered something that brought them profound contentment. When occasionally one of them approached the counter where the merchant displayed dried meat for sale, their behavior followed a consistent pattern. They'd inhale the meat scent intensely and at length, like predators identifying quarry. But now a subtle difference had emerged. They seemed to be comparing that meat against something they knew intimately, and they always appeared disappointed by what they found. Father Gilbert Horton, who oversaw the small wooden church serving the region, had attempted on multiple occasions to visit the Broussard family and offer religious services. Every attempt was met with courteous yet resolute rejection, always delivered by Aucht, who would materialize at the property's entrance, blocking any effort to advance further. During these brief exchanges, the priest noticed perpetual movement in the shadows behind Aucht. Figures shifting between the sheds and cabins, monitoring the conversation from afar. It was as though the entire family remained constantly vigilant, poised to conceal themselves or flee at the slightest hint of danger. The priest managed to count at least 12 distinct individuals observing from a distance during a single visit. The Broussard family structure had grown so convoluted that even they seemed unable to maintain complete clarity about the relationships. Generations of unions between siblings, cousins, and even between parents and offspring had woven a kinship network where traditional distinctions had ceased to matter. Aucht simultaneously served as father, uncle, and cousin to numerous children, while Cordelia functioned as sister, aunt, and mother to various family members. This extended inbreeding had produced children bearing subtle yet noticeable deformities, facial asymmetries, dental abnormalities, speech impediments, and most alarmingly, visibly diminished mental capacities. The youngsters demonstrated absolute submission to the adults, particularly to Clemenos, who wielded an almost hypnotic control over all younger members. Throughout the winter months, when roads deteriorated and became treacherous for travel, the Broussard family virtually disappeared from public sight. With 14 mouths to feed and no apparent income source beyond meat sales, these periods of complete seclusion raised troubling questions about how they managed to survive, and survive well. It was during these intervals that the strangest rumors circulated among local inhabitants. Strange illuminations glimpsed in the distance toward the property. Inexplicable odors carried on the wind during nighttime hours. Sounds that didn't seem entirely human echoing through the marshlands. Some hunters reported spotting figures moving in groups through thick vegetation, always maintaining distance, always vanishing before clear identification became possible. The family had engineered a highly systematic work arrangement where each member bore specific responsibilities determined by age and capability. Adults managed the most demanding activities and critical decisions. Teenagers functioned as assistants and messengers. Younger children handled simple yet vital tasks essential to the community's operation. Yet something fundamentally disturbing characterized how this organization functioned. It didn't resemble the normal structure of a laboring rural family, but something more akin to a military operation, or perhaps more accurately, a criminal enterprise where each member understood precisely their role without requiring explanation. Beginning in 1902, observant individuals noticed the family appeared to have established specific timetables for different activities. There were intervals when the entire property fell completely silent, as if all residents had vanished. These quiet periods were invariably followed by days of furious activity, constant movement between buildings and smoke billowing from multiple chimneys at once. The inaugural family to vanish was the Morrisons in March 1902. James Morrison, his wife Sarah, and their 3 small children were traveling from Shreveport to a modest farming community inland, where James had secured employment at a lumber mill. They departed on a Monday morning, their wagon loaded with their meager possessions and provisions sufficient for the 2-day journey. The wagon was discovered 3 days later by a crew of lumberjacks, abandoned in a clearing roughly 5 kilometers from the Broussard property. The horses had been released and were wandering the vicinity, still wearing their harnesses but visibly agitated and frightened. Inside the wagon, all the family's belongings remained untouched: clothing, implements, even a small amount of money James had carried for contingencies. What most baffled the authorities was the complete absence of any signs of struggle. No blood stained the wagon. No marks of violence were evident. Not even footprints indicated where the family had gone. It was as though 5 human beings had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only their possessions and 2 terrorized horses. Sheriff Augustus Landry, a seasoned lawman who dealt with every variety of crime in the region, found himself genuinely mystified. In his 20 years of service, he'd witnessed murders, thefts, abductions, but never anything remotely like this. According to his official documentation, it was as if the family had been taken by ghosts, an observation that would prove ironically close to the actual truth. A mere 2 weeks later, the Thibault family suffered the same fate. Pierre Thibault, a New Orleans merchant, was journeying with his wife Marie and their teenage daughter Émilie to visit relatives inland. They too disappeared without leaving any trace, their wagon discovered under identical circumstances, abandoned with all possessions intact, yet devoid of any sign of the occupants. The pattern established itself rapidly and horrifyingly. Throughout the remainder of 1902, 6 additional families vanished, following precisely the same template. Always families traveling alone on backcountry roads. Always wagons discovered abandoned in the same general area. Always the total absence of clues regarding the disappeared person's fate. The local community descended into genuine panic. Throughout 1903, the situation grew even more dire. 12 families disappeared over the course of the year, averaging 1 family monthly. Terror in the region had become palpable, and numerous merchants outright refused to travel rural roads, opting instead to make enormous detours or simply cancel their journeys entirely. It was during this period of escalating dread that Father Gilbert Horton began observing disturbing details about the Broussard family. During his pastoral rounds through the region, he'd noticed that the number of people on the property seemed to fluctuate inexplicably. Sometimes he observed many figures moving among the structures. Other times the property appeared nearly deserted. Even more troubling was the children's behavior when they occasionally materialized in the village. They moved as a collective unit, always under rigorous adult surveillance, displaying a discipline that transcended normalcy for children their ages. It was as though they'd been trained for specific public behaviors, concealing their authentic nature behind a meticulously constructed facade. In his private journal, the priest documented his observations. The Broussard family continues to perplex and unsettle me. During my most recent visit attempt, I observed at least 12 distinct individuals moving about the property, including several children who exhibit a vitality they previously lacked. The physical resemblance among all of them remains deeply disturbing. Yet now there's something additional, a satisfaction, almost a joy, that didn't exist in prior years. The priest also noted that the children had developed a completely transformed relationship with food, particularly with meat. On occasions when they came to town, they approached the local butcher shop with a confidence he described as intimate knowledge. It was no longer mere curiosity, but something suggesting profound and personal familiarity. The local merchant reported to the priest several incidents that had left him profoundly uncomfortable. The Broussard children now examined meat with the precision of specialists. And when they believed no one was watching, some of them made remarks in French that, even without complete comprehension, sounded like technical assessments of quality and preparation. Throughout 1904, the disappearance pattern continued with horrifying consistency. 10 more families vanished, always adhering to the same methodology. The local population had organized themselves into travel groups. Nobody dared journey alone anymore, and many rural roads stood virtually abandoned. It was during this year that the priest began detecting a disturbing correlation. Whenever a family disappeared, the Broussard property would fall completely silent for 2 to 3 days, as if all inhabitants had vanished. When activity resumed, intense movement between the sheds would commence, smoke would pour from multiple chimneys, and a distinctive odor that the wind occasionally carried to nearby roads would emerge. The local merchant, when questioned by the priest about these observations, confirmed an even more unsettling pattern. According to him, following each period of silence on the property, the family would appear in town with exceptionally large quantities of salted meat to sell. The meat invariably bore the same strange appearance and peculiar smell. But now there was vastly more of it. Even more concerning was the children's demeanor during these post-disappearance visits. They seemed more animated, more alert, as if they'd been abundantly fed following a period of deprivation. Some displayed almost manic energy, contrasting sharply with the lethargy they typically exhibited. During the first half of 1905, 6 additional families disappeared, maintaining the terrifying pattern that had been established. By this time, the region surrounding Shreveport existed in a state of absolute panic. Entire families had abandoned their rural properties to relocate to the city, and commerce between communities had virtually ceased. Father Gilbert Horton, observing the disappearance pattern and the increasingly suspicious behavior of the Broussard family, concluded it was time for a more thorough investigation. Throughout the summer of 1905, he began taking regular walks through the region, paying particular attention to the areas surrounding the Broussard property. It was during one of these walks in August 1905 that he made a discovery that would alter everything. Walking along a trail passing roughly 1 kilometer from the property, the priest detected a strange smell in the air. It wasn't the typical odor of decomposition one would anticipate finding in a swamp, but something different, sweeter yet simultaneously more sickening. Following the scent, he arrived at an area where intense summer rains had eroded part of the soft soil, exposing what had been shallowly buried. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he understood about human nature. Fragments of fabric clearly belonging to human clothing protruded from the saturated earth. These weren't old rags or discarded garments, but torn pieces of dresses, shirts, and trousers that appeared to have been violently ripped away. There were shoes of varying sizes, including small children's shoes, some still containing socks inside. Carefully excavating around the objects, the priest uncovered more disturbing evidence. coat buttons, belt buckles, simple jewelry, children's toys, and even several human teeth mixed with the soil. The quantity of objects suggested this location had been utilized as a disposal site for the remains of multiple people over a considerable time span. That evening, Father Gilbert Horton wrote in his diary, "I discovered today evidence that confirms my gravest fears about the fate of the disappeared families. The quantity of personal objects buried near the Broussard property, combined with the family's transformed behavior and the temporal pattern of disappearances, leads me to a conclusion that my Christian mind refuses to fully accept." Throughout the following weeks, the priest continued his discreet investigations. He mapped the locations where the abandoned wagons had been discovered and realized that all fell within a few kilometers radius of the Broussard property. More significantly, all disappearances had occurred on roads passing near pathways leading directly to the family's territory. The priest also began documenting the family's activity patterns. He confirmed that whenever a family vanished, the Broussard property fell completely silent for 2 to 3 days. On the 4th day, activity would resume with intensity, and on the 5th or 6th day, family members would materialize in town with substantial quantities of meat to sell. The local merchant, when presented with this chronology by the priest, visibly recoiled. According to him, the pattern proved so precise that he had unconsciously begun anticipating visits from the Broussard family several days after learning of each disappearance. The regularity was too disturbing to be mere coincidence. Even more alarming was the quality of the meat the family delivered. According to the merchant, it had improved substantially since 1902. It was better cut, better preserved, and prepared with a technique suggesting considerable expertise. It was as though whoever processed it had refined their methods through persistent practice. Make sure you subscribe to the channel because the story I'm about to unfold goes beyond anything you can imagine about the boundaries of human depravity. Father Gilbert Horton spent weeks tormented by what he'd uncovered. The evidence he'd discovered in the area near the Broussard property kept him awake through the nights, praying and attempting to find an explanation that didn't involve the horrors his mind was beginning to construct. Finally, in September 1905, he made the decision that would transform everything. He approached Sheriff Augustus Landry. The conversation between the priest and the sheriff occurred on a sweltering September afternoon in the makeshift office that Landry maintained in a rear chamber of the Shreveport City Hall. The priest arrived visibly shaken, carrying a leather satchel where he'd stored some of the evidence he'd found: fabric fragments, buttons, shoes of different sizes, children's toys, and a small rag doll that continued to haunt him. According to official investigation records, the priest reported his discoveries in exhaustive detail, including his observations about the abnormally large number of people inhabiting the property, the excessive physical similarities among the children, the family's transformed behavior since 1902, and crucially, the precise temporal correlation between disappearances and the Broussard family's activities. Landry, a pragmatic man who'd learned to trust the priest's instincts over the years, meticulously examined each item Gilbert had brought. The rag doll, particularly, captured his attention. It was a simple doll, the type working families created for their daughters. Yet it was stained with something dark that resembled old blood. What disturbed him most was recognizing the fabric used to construct the doll. It was identical to the dress little Amélie Thibault wore when her family disappeared in 1902. Landry decided immediate official investigation was warranted. The following day, he assembled a search party composed of 8 deputies and 4 tracking dogs borrowed from local farmers. The objective: conduct a systematic search in the area surrounding the Broussard property, seeking more evidence, or in the worst scenario, the bodies of the 42 people who had vanished over the previous 4 years. The search commenced in the area where the priest had made his discoveries. The dogs immediately became agitated, barking and digging at multiple different locations. In less than 2 hours, the team had discovered an area far more extensive than the priest had initially imagined. The soft swamp soil had preserved hundreds of personal objects scattered across an area spanning almost an acre. Shoes of every size, from men's boots to tiny children's shoes, emerged from the earth in various states of decomposition. Fragments of dresses, shirts, trousers, and undergarments lay scattered throughout the area, many torn in ways suggesting extreme violence. There were also personal items, wedding rings, pocket watches, combs, broken spectacles, children's toys, and even family Bibles. But when they began excavating deeper, they made the discovery that would confirm their worst fears. Approximately half a meter down, the deputies uncovered bones. Numerous bones. Human bones of varying sizes, including bones clearly belonging to small children, mixed with animal bones in an obvious attempt to disguise the true nature of what was buried there. Dr. Rodney Manning, the local physician who also served as coroner when necessary, was summoned to examine the remains. His initial analysis, recorded in the official investigation files, confirmed that bones from at least 22 different people were buried in that first area. What disturbed him most was the systematic manner in which the bones had been treated. Many displayed precise cut marks, as if the flesh had been removed by someone with considerable butchering expertise. According to the medical report, the bones had been processed in a way Dr. Manning described as professional and efficient butchering. The cut marks were consistent and precise, suggesting that whoever performed the work possessed not only experience but also appropriate tools for processing large quantities of human flesh. The revelation struck the investigation team like a physical blow. Landry, despite all his experience, recorded in his reports that he felt physically sickened upon fully grasping what they were confronting. This wasn't merely mass murder, but an industrial-scale cannibalism operation that had functioned with terrifying efficiency for 4 years without detection. The decision was made instantly. It was time to confront the Broussard family directly. The following day, Landry organized an operation with 15 armed men to approach the property. They understood they were dealing with at least 14 dangerous individuals, including several adults who had participated in the murder of 42 people. The Broussard property, viewed up close and with investigative scrutiny, proved even more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. What from a distance appeared to be merely a poorly maintained farm was actually a complex meticulously organized to conceal and facilitate horrific activities on an industrial scale. The first shed they investigated contained what could only be described as a makeshift industrial slaughterhouse. Multiple wooden tables stained with ancient blood. Knives of varying sizes adapted from agricultural implements. Bone saws. Dozens of metal hooks suspended from the ceiling. The stench in the place was unbearable, a mixture of dried blood, decomposition, and something sweet and nauseating that none of the men could identify. According to investigation reports, the shed was organized like a highly efficient assembly line. Specific areas existed for different stages of the process, an area for initial slaughter, another for skin removal, a third for cutting and separating meat by type and quality, and finally, an area for preservation and storage. The operation had clearly been refined over years of continuous practice. A second shed contained preservation equipment on an impressive scale. More than 50 wooden barrels filled with salt. Extensive shelving for drying meat. Even a sophisticated smoking area. The sheer volume of equipment suggested the family processed far more meat than they could personally consume, confirming suspicions that they sold a significant portion of their production disguised as legitimate game meat. A third shed revealed something even more shocking, a storage area organized like a commercial warehouse. Shelves categorized by meat type, victim age, and preparation method. Improvised labels in French identified different products. There was even a rotation system ensuring older meat was utilized first. But it was at the rear of the property that they made the most horrifying discovery. A series of 6 large pits excavated in the soft swamp soil contained a grotesque mixture of human and animal bones. The pits were systematically organized, the oldest already completely filled, new ones being dug as needed. Dr. Manning, examining the pits, estimated they contained the remains of the other 20 people who had disappeared. The organization suggested the family had operated their cannibalism system with industrial efficiency, processing an average of more than 10 people annually during the past 4 years. The police operation had arrived at a critical moment. When the officers approached the main house, they could hear agitated voices emanating from inside, speaking in that ancient French dialect characteristic of the family. Frantic movement occurred between the sheds and cabins, as if the entire family was attempting to conceal evidence or prepare a coordinated escape. Landry positioned his men around the entire property before announcing himself. He knew he was dealing with 14 people who had participated in the murder and processing of 42 victims, and had no intention of granting them any opportunity to flee or organize resistance. According to official records, when the sheriff identified himself and ordered everyone to exit the buildings, the response came in the form of total pandemonium. Figures fled in all directions. Voices screamed in French. It became evident the family had prepared escape routes through the swamps. The deputies managed to intercept some, but others vanished into the dense vegetation with the efficiency of those who knew every trail and hiding place in the region. When the chaos finally subsided, the officers had captured only part of the family: Clemenos, the elderly matriarch, Cordelia, and 5 of the younger children: Octave, Sidonie, the twins Alcée and Anatole, and little Azélie. 7 family members had succeeded in escaping to the swamps: Augt, Lay, Boudreaux, Beauregard, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste. The complete investigation of the property revealed even more disturbing evidence. Besides the makeshift slaughterhouses and bone pits, investigators discovered personal objects clearly belonging to the disappeared families, organized as trophies. An entire cabin was dedicated to storing clothing, jewelry, tools, and toys from the victims, some being utilized by the Broussard family as if they were their own possessions. Even more shocking was the discovery of detailed records maintained by Clemenos. Written in archaic French, the notebooks documented each family attacked over the 4 years, including descriptions of victim numbers, quality of meat obtained, specific preparation methods, and even evaluations of which family members provided the superior meat. It resembled a macabre recipe library developed and refined with scientific precision. In the main house, investigators found evidence that the children had been systematically trained to participate in all family activities. Children's drawings depicted scenes of hunting and meat processing that were clearly human. Toys fashioned from worked human bones. Even a makeshift manual teaching children to identify different types of human flesh. Dr. Manning, in his final report on the property investigation, concluded that the Broussard family had operated the most organized and efficient cannibalism system ever documented. The operation's scale, involving 14 people working in perfect coordination to process more than 10 victims annually, had allowed them to function as a genuine human meat industry. The arrest of Clemenos Broussard, Cordelia, and the 5 children marked the beginning of the most disturbing phase of the entire investigation. Sheriff Landry had prepared several rooms in the jail for interrogations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the revelations that would emerge from such a complex and systematized family operation. Clemenos, despite her 75 years, demonstrated a lucidity and coldness that chilled the blood. According to interrogation records, she seated herself in the wooden chair with an expression mixing contempt and a strange superiority, as if the officers were children asking foolish questions about matters beyond their comprehension. Her initial statements, recorded in official files, immediately revealed the distorted mentality that had developed in the family across generations. According to Clemenos, they had committed no wrongdoing. They had simply perfected their ancestral traditions to satisfy the requirements of a large family. She expressed genuine bewilderment about why their actions were deemed criminal, repeatedly comparing them to the work of butchers and farmers. Cordelia, 38 years old, demonstrated fanatical devotion to her mother and family traditions. During her interrogations, she confirmed every detail provided by Clemenos, but with even more disturbing coldness and technical pride in the methods they'd developed. According to official records, Cordelia discussed the murders and processing of human flesh with the same casualness and precision that a chef would discuss elaborate recipes. Dr. Rodney Manning, summoned to examine the 5 captured children, made discoveries confirming the worst suspicions about the family environment's effects. The children, Octave at 12, Sidonie at 10, the twins Alcée and Anatole at 8, and little Azélie at only 6, displayed clear signs of generations of inbreeding, facial deformities, asymmetrical jaws, irregular dentition, and evident delays in cognitive development. Even more disturbing was their behavior. According to medical reports, they demonstrated intense fear of anyone outside the family, yet absolute obedience to any order from Clemenos or Cordelia. When either woman spoke, even in whispers, all the children immediately ceased whatever they were doing and paid total attention, like well-trained soldiers receiving commander's orders. During the initial formal interrogations, Landry attempted a cautious approach with the older children. What he discovered, documented in his official reports, challenged his understanding of normal child development and family structures. When questioned about kinship, Octave identified Auct as his father, Cordelia as his mother, but also referred to Clemenose as his grandmother-mother, and Magnolia as his aunt-sister. The family structure had grown so convoluted and distorted that even the children themselves couldn't explain it consistently. Each child had multiple fathers and mothers depending on which kinship line was followed. Subsequent investigations revealed the disturbing truth about the Broussard family structure. Through conversations with Clemenose and observation of the children, it became evident the family had practiced systematic inbreeding for at least 4 generations. Auct simultaneously functioned as father, uncle, cousin, and half-brother to several children, depending on which relationship was considered. Clemenose, when she finally decided to speak about the family structure, revealed this information with a naturalness that shocked everyone present. According to her recorded statements, the family had always maintained pure blood, not permitting strangers to marry family members or family members to marry outside the clan. The result was a lineage where traditional family distinctions had become completely irrelevant. Dr. Manning, examining the improvised family records discovered in the house, managed to trace at least 4 generations of marriages between siblings, cousins, uncles, and nieces, and even between parents and children. The result was a genetically devastated lineage where physical and mental deformities had become the norm rather than the exception. But when the interrogation turned to the family disappearances, the revelations became truly horrific. Clemenose, perhaps realizing there was nothing left to conceal, began discussing the hunts with a frankness and technical pride that left investigators nauseated. According to her recorded statements, the operation had been developed and perfected over the previous 4 years. In 1902, according to Clemenose, the family had decided it was time to expand their food sources to adequately sustain 14 people. What had begun as necessity had transformed into a highly organized and efficient operation. The operation was divided into specific phases, each with clearly defined responsibilities. Families traveling alone were first identified and observed by the younger family members who served as scouts. Thibodeau and Celeste particularly specialized in approaching traveling families, pretending to be lost or needy children. When a suitable family was located, preferably with several children, as according to Clemenose they provided more tender meat, Auct, Beauregard, and the older children approached, offering help, directions, or simply rural hospitality. The approach process was carefully planned to inspire total confidence. The Broussards presented themselves as a hospitable rural family, offering water for the horses, food for the children, or simply friendly conversation to break the monotony of travel. City people, according to Clemenose, always trusted country folk, especially when children were involved. It was a trust they had learned to exploit with surgical precision. The attack itself was swift, coordinated, and lethal. According to the confessions, different family members had specific roles. Some distracted the victims with conversation. Others positioned themselves strategically around the wagon. And when Clemenose gave the signal, always she who determined the precise moment, the entire family attacked simultaneously. The victims were killed quickly, typically with precise blows to the head using heavy hammers, to prevent screams and unnecessary suffering. Clemenose made a point of emphasizing they weren't sadistic, merely practical. Swift death was a matter of efficiency and, in her distorted mind, even compassion. The transportation and processing procedure, as described in the statements, revealed the impressive level of organization behind the operation. The bodies were loaded onto covered wagons the family maintained specifically for this purpose, while the victims' wagons were abandoned in strategic locations to confuse authorities. All processing was conducted in the sheds investigators had discovered, with each family member bearing specific responsibilities based on age and skill. The youngest children assisted with simple tasks like cleaning. Adolescents aided in cutting and separation. Adults handled the more technical and demanding labor. The phrase that would become the symbol of the Broussard family's depravity was recorded during these interrogations: meat is meat, family is family, and business is business. According to Clemenose, they had transformed a survival necessity into an efficient commercial operation that sustained the entire family. Cordelia, during her own interrogations, provided even more specific technical details about processing. According to her statements, the family had developed specific methods for different types of flesh. Adults were processed one way, children another, and even different body parts had specific uses and values. It was like a macabre science developed and refined through years of constant practice. The preservation and distribution system proved equally organized and commercial. Part of the meat was consumed fresh by the family. Part was salted and stored for future consumption. And a significant portion, approximately half of each harvest, was prepared specifically for sale in town. Cordelia explained they had learned to season and prepare human flesh so that it was not only indistinguishable from game meat when sold to local merchants but actually superior in flavor and texture. According to her statements, they had developed preparation techniques that made human flesh more flavorful than any animal meat. The children, when questioned separately, confirmed the adults' accounts with a naturalness that was perhaps even more disturbing than the adults' coldness. For them, cannibalism wasn't an aberration but simply how life functioned. They had grown up participating in every aspect of the operation, from victim identification to final meat processing, and considered it as normal as other children would consider helping with harvest. According to interrogation records, when Sidonie was questioned about her diet, she responded that they had always eaten that way, but that in the past 4 years the food had improved greatly. She mentioned that Clemenos taught them it was superior to butcher shop meat because they knew exactly where it came from, how it had been prepared, and could select the best pieces. Octave, when asked if he understood they were eating people, responded with distorted logic that revealed how profoundly the family had disconnected from normal morality. According to official records, he expressed genuine confusion about why this would be problematic, arguing that people were animals too, that everyone was made of the same flesh, and that they had simply found a better and more reliable food source. Dr. Manning, attempting to understand the children's mental state, discovered they not only participated in cannibalism but had developed specific and sophisticated preferences. Octave preferred meat from young adults. Sidonie had a preference for children her own age. The twins had developed specific tastes based on the victim's gender. Even more disturbing, the children discussed these preferences with the same naturalness other children would discuss their favorite foods. They had opinions about preparation methods, seasonings, and even about which families had provided the superior meat. It was as if they were little gastronomic connoisseurs specialized in cannibalism. The investigation revealed the family had killed and consumed exactly 42 people over 4 years, an average of more than 10 people annually. The Morrisons, Thibos, and other families had been completely eliminated. Their bodies processed and consumed or sold. Their belongings catalogued and stored as trophies or sold when possible. Clemenos, when confronted with the magnitude of her crimes during the final interrogations, showed no remorse. Instead, according to official records, she seemed genuinely proud of what she had accomplished. She repeatedly compared her actions to the success of a prosperous farm, arguing she had fed and sustained a large family for years using only available resources and her own intelligence. During one of the most revealing interrogations, Clemenos explained how the tradition had evolved over generations. According to her accounts, the practice had begun with her own grandfather, who during a particularly harsh winter had consumed a traveler who died of natural causes near the property. The experience had been a revelation that transformed into an occasional family tradition. But it was in 1902, according to Clemenos, that she had the vision to transform a sporadic family tradition into a systematic and profitable operation. With 14 mouths to feed and limited resources, she had realized that rural roads offered a constant and renewable source of food and income. Clemenos described the operation's development with the pride of a successful entrepreneur. They had started with rudimentary methods in 1902 but quickly perfected their techniques. By 1903 they were already operating with industrial efficiency. In 1904 and 1905 they had achieved what she called operational perfection. Cordelia, complimenting Clemenos's accounts, explained that each family member had specialized in specific aspects of the operation. Alpt and Beauregard were specialists in approaching and eliminating victims. Ulle and Magnolia were responsible for initial processing. Boudreaux had specialized in preservation and preparation for sale. The adolescents had their own specialties. Thibodeau was expert at identifying vulnerable families. Celeste specialized in gaining children's trust. Even the younger children had specific roles. The twins were responsible for cleaning bones. Sidonie helped in separating meat by quality. And even little Azeli had tasks appropriate for her age. The quality system they had developed was impressively sophisticated. According to Cordelia, they categorized meat by age, sex, victim's physical condition, and even by occupation. Merchants who performed physical labor provided different meat than sedentary merchants. They had developed specific preparation methods for different types of customers in town. Meat destined for the local merchant was prepared one way. Meat for other buyers was prepared differently. Some buyers had unknowingly developed preferences for specific game that the family provided. The financial operation was equally organized. According to the statements, they generated sufficient income not only to purchase essential supplies but also to gradually improve their facilities and equipment. Part of the money was reinvested in the operation. Part was saved for emergencies. Clemenos revealed they had planned to expand the operation. According to her plans, they eventually intended to operate in multiple regions, possibly establishing branches of the family operation in other isolated areas of Louisiana. It was an entrepreneurial vision applied to mass cannibalism. During the final interrogations, it became crystal clear the family didn't view their actions as crimes but as an innovative and efficient way of life. They had created a sustainable system that met all their needs, food, income, and even entertainment, because, according to several statements, they genuinely enjoyed the work they performed. The complete absence of remorse or even understanding that they had done something wrong was the most disturbing aspect of all the interrogations. For the Broussard family, they had simply found an intelligent solution to the challenges of isolated rural life. The fact that this solution involved the murder and consumption of 42 people was, for them, irrelevant. The trial of the Broussard family became one of the most disturbing and complex cases in Louisiana judicial history. The improvised courthouse in Shreveport was packed with curious onlookers, journalists from across the country, and relatives of victims, all attempting to understand how an entire family had transformed into an industrial organization of cannibal killers. Clemenos Broussard, as the matriarch and confessed leader of the operation, became the primary focus of the trial. At 75 years old, she sat in the defendant's dock with the same expression of cold superiority she had demonstrated during interrogations. According to court records, when the judge read the charges, 42 premeditated murders, systematic cannibalism, destruction of evidence, operation of a criminal organization, she listened with an expression of boredom, as if they were discussing trivial business matters. Cordelia, tried as principal accomplice and technical organizer of the operation, demonstrated the same coldness as her mother but with additional arrogance that disturbed observers even more. During her testimony, according to court transcripts, she not only confirmed all details of the crimes but even corrected the prosecutor when he incorrectly described some technical aspects of human meat processing, as if she were delivering a butchering lesson. The prosecutor, an experienced man who had dealt with the worst crimes in the region, later admitted in interviews he had never confronted a case that disturbed him so profoundly. According to his statements, it wasn't merely the nature of the crimes or even their industrial scale, but the complete absence of remorse or even understanding that they had done something wrong. It was like judging people of a completely different species who operated under a totally alien moral system. During her testimony, Clemenos maintained the same posture she had demonstrated in interrogations. According to trial transcripts, she confirmed all details of the murders and cannibalism, but always with the attitude of someone explaining a successful business to people who couldn't comprehend her genius. She even expressed frustration with the court's ignorance about basic matters of survival and operational efficiency. Official records show she repeatedly justified her actions as necessary and intelligent for the survival of a large family under difficult conditions. According to her testimony, people who lived in the city with access to butcher shops and stores couldn't understand what it meant to feed 14 people in complete isolation. She and her family, according to her words, had found an innovative and efficient solution to this problem. When the judge asked if she felt any remorse for the 42 people they had killed, including 16 children, her response chilled the blood of everyone present. According to official transcripts, she questioned why she should feel remorse for feeding her family and generating honest income, comparing her actions to the work of farmers who kill cattle and arguing that both followed the same logic of survival and business. The 5 captured Broussard children presented an extremely complex legal and moral dilemma. Clearly victims of an extremely dysfunctional family environment, they had also actively participated in crimes for years. Dr. Rodney Manning, after months of detailed observation, concluded they suffered from severe psychological and cognitive damage resulting from both inbreeding and systematic conditioning since birth. In his official report presented to the court, Dr. Manning wrote that the children had been molded since birth to see cannibalism as normal, necessary, and even desirable. They didn't possess the moral development necessary to understand the nature of their acts, being simultaneously perpetrators and victims of a deeply distorted family system that had functioned as a conditioning machine for generations. The court decided the children would be sent to different religious orphanages in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and other distant cities where they would attempt rehabilitation through intensive moral and religious education. The process would be long and uncertain, as no one knew if it was possible to reverse years of such extreme and systematic psychological conditioning. Octave and Sidonie, the two oldest children, demonstrated some capacity to learn new behaviors but continued to have profound difficulties understanding why their old practices were considered wrong. According to orphanage reports, they frequently asked when they could return home and resume the family work. The twins, Alcy and Anatole, presented greater adaptation difficulties, demonstrating aggressive behaviors when forced to eat only animal meat. According to medical records, they even attempted to bite other orphans during meals, explaining they were truly hungry and that the orphanage food didn't feed properly. Little Azélie, only 6 years old, showed the greatest capacity for adaptation, possibly because she had been less exposed to the more extreme aspects of family activities. After years of intensive education, she managed to develop some understanding of normal social behaviors. Clémeneuse Broussard was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was executed in December 1905 on a cold and rainy morning. According to witnesses present, until the end she maintained her posture of cold superiority. Her last words, officially recorded, were a somber prediction that others would understand and adopt her methods when true necessity came to their families. Cordelia received a sentence of life imprisonment but died in prison just 2 years later in 1907 from a lung infection. According to guard reports, until the end she refused to eat any meat that wasn't human, preferring to consume only bread and vegetables. She died malnourished but maintaining her convictions and pride in the work she had done. Meanwhile, the search for the 7 family members who had escaped, Augt, Lay, Boudreaux, Beauregard, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste, continued for months. The Louisiana swamps offered countless hiding places, and the family knew the terrain better than any pursuer. Occasionally, hunters reported seeing figures moving in the most remote areas of the swamp, but could never get close enough to confirm if they were the fugitive Broussards. In March 1906, 6 months after the escape, lumberjacks found the remains of an improvised fire on a small island in the middle of the swamp. Around the fire were bones that Dr. Manning identified as human. The analysis suggested that at least 3 people had been killed and consumed at that location, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to determine if the victims were strangers captured by the fugitives or members of the family itself. Dr. Manning speculated in his reports that isolation and lack of other food sources could have led the fugitives to turn on each other. Cannibalism, once normalized and systematized, could easily expand to include any available source of meat, including family members, when other options were exhausted. During the summer of 1906, fishermen reported sightings of skeletal figures moving through the swamps, always at a distance, always disappearing when someone attempted to approach. The descriptions varied, but all mentioned visibly malnourished people wearing rags and moving in ways that suggested extreme desperation and possibly internal violence. The last confirmed evidence of the fugitive Broussard's presence came in August 1906 when a fisherman found torn and blooded clothes on a remote riverbank. The clothes were identified as belonging to Olay and Magnolia, but no bodies were found. There were signs of violent struggle in the area, suggesting the fugitives had turned on each other. Theories about the fugitives' fate varied among investigators. Some believed they had died of starvation or disease in the swamps. Others speculated they had killed each other in a dispute over increasingly scarce resources. The most accepted theory was that the family hierarchy had collapsed without Clémeneuse to maintain order, resulting in fatal internal violence. Sheriff Landry, in his final reports on the case, expressed the opinion that the fugitives probably hadn't survived the first winter in the swamps. According to his analysis, even with their knowledge of the terrain, it would be impossible for 7 people to survive indefinitely without adequate supplies, especially considering that several of them were adolescents without complete experience in independent survival. The Broussard property was burned by authorities in September 1906. According to official reports, the fire lasted 5 days, fueled not only by the wood of the constructions but also by animal fat that had impregnated the soil over 4 years of intensive use as an industrial slaughterhouse. The smell of the burning, according to local reports, was unbearable and could be detected for kilometers. Even after the complete destruction of the property, the area remained avoided by locals. Hunters and fishermen reported strange sensations when approaching the location, a feeling of being watched, inexplicable smells in the air, and a general atmosphere of unease that made them want to leave quickly. During the floods of 1907 and 1908, regional residents reported that bones continued to emerge from the soft swamp soil. The floodwaters carried fragments of bones and personal objects that had been buried over the 4 years of operation. Each flood brought new evidence of the family's crimes, as if the earth itself refused to keep its secrets buried. The Broussard children who survived in orphanages had varied and mostly tragic fates. Octave died in 1912 at 19 years old from an infection that doctors suspected was self-inflicted through wounds he made on himself. Until the end, reports show he continued to ask about other family members and express confusion about why he couldn't resume the family work. Sidonie lived until 1918 but never managed to form normal relationships or completely understand why her old practices were considered wrong. She was transferred several times between different institutions, always due to incidents involving attempts to convince other children to try raw meat or aggressive behaviors during meals. She died at 23 during the Spanish flu epidemic. The twins Alcee and Anatole were separated in 1908 after a series of violent incidents in orphanages. Alcee died in 1910 at 15 years old after attempting to attack a supervisor with a kitchen knife during a meal. Anatole was transferred to an institution for the mentally ill where he died in 1915 at 20 years old, still expressing the desire to return to his family in the swamps. Only Azélie achieved some degree of social reintegration. After years of intensive religious education, she developed basic social behaviors and was adopted by a family in another state in 1912 at 13 years old, with a completely new identity. According to later records, she lived a relatively normal life, married, and had children, but never spoke about her childhood with anyone, taking her secrets to the grave when she died in 1954 at 55 years old. The Broussard case had lasting repercussions in the region and beyond. Rural roads around Shreveport remained little used for years, with many merchants preferring longer but considered safer routes. Trust in rural hospitality, a tradition deeply rooted in Southern culture, was severely shaken for decades. Father Gilbert Horton, traumatized by his discovery and the role he played in the investigation, requested transfer to a parish in another state in 1907. In his last notes about the case, he wrote, "I saw what human beings can become when they completely lose their connection with God and with humanity. An entire family transformed into a death machine, not by demonic possession, but by deliberate choice and systematic planning. May the Lord forgive me, but there is knowledge that no man should carry." Dr. Manning continued to study the medical and psychological aspects of the case for years, eventually publishing several academic articles about the effects of prolonged inbreeding on cognitive and moral development and about how extreme social isolation can lead family groups to develop moral systems completely disconnected from normal society. Sheriff Landry, despite his experience with violent crimes, admitted in later interviews that the Broussard case had fundamentally changed his view of human nature and the limits of organized depravity. He implemented regular patrols in the most isolated rural areas and established protocols for investigating families living in extreme isolation. The story of the Broussard family stands as the most disturbing case of family cannibalism I've ever encountered in my life. This wasn't a temporary psychotic outbreak or isolated crimes of passion, but a systematic industrial operation that had functioned with terrifying efficiency for 4 years, processing more than 10 victims annually. What makes this case particularly haunting is the complete absence of supernatural elements. There were no curses, demonic possessions, or occult forces at work. Just human beings who, through extreme isolation, prolonged inbreeding, and a distorted entrepreneurial mentality, had transformed into something that challenges our basic understanding of human nature. The geographical isolation of the Louisiana swamps had allowed aberrant practices to develop without any external interference. The need to feed 14 people had provided the initial justification for practices that, once initiated, became self-perpetuating and increasingly elaborate. What had begun as survival necessity transformed into an efficient commercial operation in just 4 years. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story is the internal logic the family had developed to justify their actions. For them, there was no moral difference between killing an animal to eat and killing a person for the same purpose. They had simply found a more efficient and profitable way to exploit available resources. The Broussard case raises profound questions about the nature of human morality. If 14 people, including small children, are raised from birth to see cannibalism as normal and even profitable, can they be considered morally responsible for participating in it? The speed with which they transformed an occasional tradition into an industrial operation demonstrates how quickly human beings can adapt and perfect even the most horrible practices. The fact that 14 people could participate in such a horrible operation for 4 years also reminds us of how powerful social conditioning can be. The Broussard children didn't choose to become cannibals. They were molded for it from birth in an environment where such behavior was not only normal but a source of family pride. In the silent swamps of Louisiana, where cypress trees still whisper ancient secrets to the wind, the story of the Broussard family remains as a somber reminder that true monsters don't come from fairy tales or horror movies. They come from ourselves, when we lose our connection to our shared humanity and allow isolation, necessity, and efficiency to transform us into something unrecognizable. The most frightening truth about the Broussard family isn't that they were unique, but that under the right circumstances, any isolated family could develop similar systems. The difference between civilization and organized barbarism may be much smaller than we'd like to admit. The efficiency with which they operated for 4 years, processing more than 10 victims annually without detection, serves as a disturbing reminder that the most real horror doesn't come from the supernatural, but from the human capacity to organize, systematize, and perfect even the most abominable practices when we view them as necessary or advantageous. If this story left you as disturbed as it left me, and you want to hear more cases that challenge everything we think we know about human nature, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. I have many more stories like this one, each more chilling than the last. Stories that prove reality can be far more terrifying than any fiction. Don't miss the next episode because the darkness of human history has many more secrets to reveal.